This year, we are especially pleased to welcome our featured guest, Professor of English at UB, Nnedi Okorafor. This is really good to have our own being the signature series speaker. It has happened in the past, not the first time, but really good to have you here, Nnedi, talk today, tomorrow, and all the programming that goes with it. I would also want to thank and acknowledge Bruce Jackson, SUNY Distinguished Professor of English, James Agee Professor of American Culture, who will join Nnedi here on the stage later in the program for what is sure to be an interesting conversation. And of course, I want to thank Chris Miller, SUNY Distinguished Professor and Edward H. Butler Chair in English, who will introduce Nnedi later, a little bit later. I think Chris was the one who was chair probably when she recruited Nnedi from somewhere else. So I think it's important that Chris introduces her. The signature series is now in its 5th year, and this is really UB's distinctive legacy in arts and letters. At UB, we are very proud of our university's vibrant culture of creative excellence, ingenuity, and imagination. This year is no exception, as we feature the scholarship and award-winning work of Professor Nnedi Okorafor as part of the artistic and educational programming of the 2017 Signature Series. Professor Okorafor has quickly established herself as a leading voice of African-based science fiction, fantasy, and magical realism for both children and adults. As a faculty member in our internationally renowned Department of English, Professor Okorafor joins a long line of celebrated, prolific, and award-winning authors. Nnedi is a wonderful teacher and an inspiration to our students. I was talking to her, she had her class this morning around lunchtime, one of the classes she teaches, and she was supposed to teach another class on fiction writing or science fiction, and some of the students are here. So it's good that we could accommodate the teaching and the lecture at the same time. This afternoon's program will feature remarks and reading from Professor Okorafor, and then Professor Jackson will join on stage for a discussion on her work. Earlier today, some of you had opportunity to join Nnedi at our signature series small group discussion for faculty, staff, and students. I hope many of you will take advantage of the opportunity to participate in tomorrow's event as well, a screening of a short Kenyan science fiction film, Pumzi, which was screened at the Sundance Film Festival as part of its new African cinema program. This screening will take place at 1:30 p.m. at Baird Recital Hall with an opening discussion following the film. In the meantime, I hope you're all looking forward to this afternoon's conversation as much as I am. I would like now to ask distinguished professor, Dr. Chris Miller, to introduce our featured guest. Chris?
Nnedi Okorafor received a master's in journalism in 1999 and her PhD from the University of Illinois, Chicago in 2007. She taught at Chicago State University from 2007 until 2014 and was promoted to associate professor in 2013. The fall of 2014, she came to UB, and this year she was promoted from associate to full professor. That's an exceptionally short time between promotions, you might say, and you'd be right, but Nnedi is exceptional. Her first book, a young adult novel titled Zara the Windseeker, led to her winning the Wole Soyinka Prize for Literature in Africa and the Black Excellence Award for Outstanding Achievement in Literature. Her next young adult novel, The Shadow Speaker, won the Parallax Award, and Akata Witch was a finalist for several awards. Her first adult novel, Who Fears Death, won the World Fantasy Award for Best Novel, the Kindred Award, and Le Prix Imaginal for Best Translated Novel into French. Then Nnedi accepted the offer to come to UB, and her excitement, or probably more to the point, her anxiety, gave her the idea for a novella called Binti, which won the Nebula Award, the Hugo Award for Best Novella, and was the immediate prompt for Nnedi's winning the Outstanding Achievement in Literature Award. Nnedi writes like some people breathe. If she is awake and not working out or teaching or spending time with her daughter and her family, there is a good chance she is writing. The story of Binti interested her so much that she quickly wrote a sequel, Binti 2, Home, which came out this past January. Over winter break, yes, Nnedi wrote Binti 3. Since coming to UB, she has also published Lagoon and the Book of Phoenix and has a third novel forthcoming, Akata Warrior. She's working on 2 other novels. Her characters, she says, take over her brain. But one can also hear in her stories that she loves these courageous, rule-breaking, complex women and men she creates or who speak through her. This publication record would keep most humans more than busy, but Nnedi has also written plays, screenplays, worked with producers on film options for her novels, produced a 5-issue comic book series on a medieval Black Knight, and taken on diverse other projects like writing creative biographies for the Ethiopian-American hip-hop group Copperwire's album Earthbound. In her spare time, as it were, she gives readings and lectures around the world. In 2016 alone, she was a guest speaker in New Zealand, South Africa, and England, as well as in several of the United States. Such invitations and her email inbox make it seem that everyone wants to hear Nnedi read or speak about her fiction with its powerful mix of Nigerian folklore, science, her own lived experience as a Black woman in the United States and with her extended family in Nigeria, and her concerns about social and political issues in the world today. Nnedi's writing is extraordinarily rich in using speculative, fast-paced plots to grapple with the most pressing problems facing humankind: the destruction of the environment, ways to remain human in the face of overwhelming poverty or oppression, possibilities for a communication among people of different cultures and languages, the abuse of power, and the age-old, still pressing questions of how to grow up, how to deal with grief, how love both enables and inhibits us, how to express rage ethically, how to live with full humanness in a world of inequalities, unfairness, injustice. Nnedi's characters are complex and courageous, independent thinkers, and so is Nnedi herself. Her reviewers describe her as having redefined science fiction as a global cultural genre. Nnedi is, they say, a visionary thinker, a brilliantly generative game changer in challenging systemic racism and sexism, and in pushing beyond the boundaries of any single genre of writing. It is an honor for me to introduce Nnedi Okorafor here, and a great privilege for all of us that she is a part of our teaching, learning UB community. Please join me in welcoming Nnedi Okorafor.
Better put this on airplane mode. Okay. Hello, everyone. I feel extremely honored to be here. That introduction was incredible. It's, writing is such a solitary, quiet thing that you do, and then at some point, it becomes something more, and it's overwhelming when people throw it back at you, and that was beautiful. I'm going to read from two different works. I'm going to read from Binti and Who Fears Death, and first I'm going to read from Binti because Binti was really born here in Buffalo. There's a whole story behind how I wrote this story and why I wrote this story, but it really was, my coming here that inspired it. So I'm gonna read some of the beginning, and then I'm gonna jump a little deeper into the story. I powered up the transporter and said a silent prayer. I had no idea what I was going to do if it didn't work. My transporter was cheap, so even a droplet of moisture, or more likely a grain of sand, would cause it to short. It was faulty, and most of the time I had to restart it over and over before it worked. Please not now, I thought. The transporter shivered in the sand, and I held my breath. Tiny, flat, and black as a prayer stone, it buzzed softly and then slowly rose from the sand. Finally, it produced the baggage-lifting force. I grinned. Now I could make it to the shuttle. I swiped ojitse from my forehead with my index finger and knelt down. Then I touched the finger to the sand, grounding the sweet-smelling red clay into it. Thank you, I whispered. It was a half-mile walk along the dark desert road. With the transporter working, I would make it there on time. Straightening up, I paused and shut my eyes. Now the weight of my entire life was pressing on my shoulders. I was defying the most traditional part of myself for the first time in my entire life. I was leaving it in the dead of night, and they had no clue. My 9 siblings, all older than me except my younger sister and brother, would never see this coming. My parents would never imagine I'd do such a thing in a million years. By the time they all realized what I'd done and where I was going, I'd have left the planet. In my absence, my parents would growl to each other that I would never be able to set foot in their home again. My 4 aunties and 2 uncles who lived down the road would shout and gossip amongst themselves about how I'd scandalized our entire bloodline. I was going to be a pariah. Go, I softly whispered to the transporter, stamping my foot. The thin metal rings I wore around each ankle jingled noisily, but I stamped my foot again. Once on, the transporter worked best when I didn't touch it. Go, I said again, sweat forming on my brow. When nothing moved, I chanced giving the 2 large suitcases sitting atop the force field a shove. They moved smoothly, and I breathed another sigh of relief. At least some luck was on my side. So now we fast forward, and Binti she goes on the ship, and now she's settling in and just doing her thing on this trip. I was the only Himba on the ship, out of nearly 500 human passengers. My tribe is obsessed with innovation and technology, but it is small, private, and as I said, we don't leave Earth. We don't like to leave Earth. We prefer to explore the universe by traveling inward as opposed to outward. No Himba has ever gone to Umza Uni. So me being the only one on the ship was not that surprising. However, just because something isn't surprising doesn't mean it's easy to deal with. The ship was packed with outward-looking people who loved mathematics, experimenting, learning, reading, inventing, studying, obsessing, revealing. The people on the ship weren't Himba, but I soon understood that they were still my people. I stood out as a Himba, but the commonality shined brighter. I made friends quickly, and by the second week in space, they were good friends. Olu, Remy, Kwuga, Nur, Anajama, Rodin. Only Olu and Remy were in my group. Everyone else I met in the dining area or the learning room where various lectures were held by professors on board the ship. They were all friends who grew up in sprawling houses, who'd never walked through the desert, who'd never stepped on a snake in the dry grass. They were girls who could not stand the rays of Earth's sun unless it was shining through a tinted window. Yet they were girls who knew what I meant when I spoke of treeing. We sat in my room, because having so few travel items, mine was the emptiest, and challenged each other to look out at the stars and imagine the most complex equation, and then split it in half, and then in half again and again. When you prolonged math fractals, you kicked yourself into treeing just enough to get lost in the shallows of the mathematical sea. And none of us would have made it into the university if we couldn't tree. But it's not easy. We were the best, and we pushed each other to get closer to God. And then there was Heru. I had never spoken to him, but we smiled across the table at each other during meal times. He was from one of those cities so far from mine that they seemed like a figment of my imagination, where there was snow and where men rode those enormous gray birds and the women could speak with those birds without moving their mouths. Once Heru was standing behind me in the dining line with one of his friends. I felt someone pick up one of my locks, and I whirled around ready to be angry. I met his eyes, and he'd quickly let go of my hair and smiled, raising his hands up defensively. I couldn't help it, he said, his fingertips reddish with my ojitse. You can't control yourself, I snapped. You have exactly 21, he said, and they're braided in tessellating triangles. Is it some sort of code? I wanted to tell him that there was a code, that the pattern spoke my family's bloodline, culture, and history, that my father had designed the code and my mother and aunties had shown me how to braid it into my hair. However, looking at Heru made my heart beat too fast and my words escaped me, so I merely shrugged and turned back around to pick up a bowl of soup. Heru was tall and had the whitest teeth I'd ever seen, and he was very good at mathematics. Few would have noticed the code in my hair. But I never got the chance to tell him that my hair was braided into the history of my people. Because what happened, happened. It occurred on the 18th day of the journey, the 5 days before we arrived on the planet Umziyuni, the most powerful and innovative sprawling university in the Milky Way. I was the happiest I had ever been in my life, and I was farther from my beloved family than I'd ever been in my life. I was at the table savoring a mouthful of gelatinous milk-based dessert with slivers of coconut in it. I was gazing at Heru, who wasn't gazing at me. I'd put my fork down and had my edan in my hands. I fiddled with it as I watched Heru talk to the boy beside me. The delicious, creamy dessert was melting coolly on my tongue. Beside me, Olu and Remy were singing a traditional song from their city because they missed home, a song that had to be sung with a wavery voice like a water spirit. Then someone screamed, and Heru's chest burst open, spattering me with his warm blood. There was a Medusa behind him. I'll stop there. So that's the beginning of Binti. To give you a little bit of the story behind when I wrote Binti, I come from both of my parents are Nigerian. My father passed in 2004. And my family, my immediate family, my mom, my sisters, and my brother, and their kids, and my kid, we're all in Chicago. And so it's sort of a family thing that everyone stays together. And a lot of that might have to do with my father's passing. It's a pretty long story. But so I wasn't happy at Chicago State, and then I got accepted to, I got accepted to be on the faculty at UB, which was wonderful, 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 wonderful. Except my family did not approve because no one leaves Chicago. And so when that happened, of course I was gonna go. Of course I was gonna take the position, but my family was very, very much against it. And so in the end, I had to pack up my stuff and come here. And so when I did that, essentially what happened was a year of disownment from my family. So it was really, really jarring. And in that, one of the things that I do when one of the things that I've come to do over time with writing is when I'm in pain, I write. And so I started writing this story about this girl, and I hate space. So, in space, that all you're meant to do in space as an Earth creature is die. So I was in a dark place, so I figured, okay, I've never written anything in space. I hate space. Let me write something about a place that I hate. So I knew I was going to write something where a character goes into space. And then this idea of Binti leaving home kind of in secret and then to go to this university, that all came from my own, I was kind of weaving in my own experience in this science fictional setting. What ended up happening on that ship, where her friend's chest bursts before her, what basically happens is everyone on that ship is killed. It's because these murderous aliens have just boarded the ship and killed everyone on that ship, and the only reason she is alive is because she's holding an object that they are allergic to. If they touch it, they die. And so that's the premise. So you think the story's going one way, everything is great, and then it takes a complete 180. And the way that happened when I was writing it was I started thinking about fear. I was here in Buffalo dealing with my familial issues, and I started thinking about fear. What if they were right? What if my family was right? What is the worst thing that could happen? So I just channeled that into the story. Okay, Binti's in space. She's going to this wonderful university. What is the worst thing that could happen? Everyone on her ship is killed, and she's there in space by herself with murderous aliens. And there you go. Ready-made plot. So yeah, I guess as I said, just as a writer, writing has always been, as Chris said, writing is very much like breathing to me. I write. That is what I do. It just comes, it's not something that I have to work at. It's just something that I do. It's something that I enjoy. But also when I'm in pain, it's something that I do. So the second piece that I'm going to read is from Who Fears Death, which is, I don't know what number novel, whatever. It's one of my novels. But this one was very close to me. This was another one of my stories, one of my books that came out of pain. Who Fears Death, I wrote it, like I said, my father passed in 2004. And I wrote Who Fears Death to deal with my father's passing. My father was a cardiovascular surgeon, so he was a heart surgeon, and he died of, one, Parkinson's, which makes your hands shake. So think about surgeon, and the worst thing that can happen to a surgeon is for them to have shaky hands. So there's that. And congestive heart failure. So there's that. So when my father passed, I was extremely angry, very, very angry. And because the way that it all happened was really, really painful for my whole family. It was just painful. We were all very close. And during his wake keeping, he was buried in Nigeria, but we had his wake keeping in Illinois. And during his wake keeping, at one point, I found myself alone. I think it was near the end where I found myself alone with him. And I remember looking at his face and thinking, that doesn't look like him anymore. He's gone. And then I just felt like this something gathering in me as I was standing there. And I knew it was, one, I knew it was very powerful. Two, I knew it was extremely destructive. Like it could just destroy that whole room. And I remember at some point my mom and my sister coming in there and taking me out of there. And it was that night that I wrote what would be the beginning of Who Fears Death, and which is what I'm going to read now. Over the years, Who Fears Death took me 6 years to write, and it was originally over 700 pages. It was 2 books, a book 1 and a book 2, and my agent read it and was like, oh, this is great, but I think we're going to, this is African science fiction. Nobody does that. And nobody does a book 1 and a book 2. I think you're going to have to bring this thing down to something shorter, to 1 book, and without changing the plot. And it took me 2 years, and he showed me a technique. That's a whole other discussion about writing that I could tell you about if you want to hear it. But it took me 2 years to bring it down to 389 pages. And I remember that. And in that time, because I write in a very nonlinear way, the beginning moved to the end, to the middle, back to the end, and then back to the beginning. And so after many years of editing and shifting things around, the first part of the story that I wrote, how it all started, was right at the beginning. And this, what I'm about to read, when I wrote it, I wasn't thinking about, I had no plot. I did not know who this character was. I was just writing. And then as I continued writing, more of it came to me. But this was the first chapter. And this is an adult novel, so you'll hear the difference between a somewhat young adulty novel, which Binti is, and then my adult novel. Chapter 1, My Father's Face. This is not an easy chapter to read. I'm going to switch to my iPad. Okay. Chapter 1, The Face of My Father. My life fell apart when I was 16. Papa died. He had such a strong heart, yet he died. Was it the heat and the smoke from his blacksmithing shop? It's true that nothing could take him from his work, his art. He loved to make the metal bend and obey him, but his work only seemed to strengthen him. He was so happy in his shop. So what was it that killed him? To this day, I can't be sure. I hope it had nothing to do with me or what I did back then. Immediately after he died, my mother came running out of their bedroom, sobbing and throwing herself against the wall. I knew then that I would be different. I knew in that moment I would never again be able to control the fire inside me. I became a different creature that day, not so human. Everything that happened later, I now understand, started then. The ceremony was held outside in the middle of the day. It was already terribly hot. His body lay on thick white cloth, surrounded by a garland of braided palm fronds. I knelt there in the sand before his body, saying my last goodbye. I'll never forget his face. It didn't look like Papa's anymore. Papa's skin was dark brown, and his lips were full. This face had sunken cheeks, deflated lips, and skin like gray-brown paper. Papa's spirit had gone elsewhere. The back of my neck prickled. My white veil was a poor protection from people's ignorant and fearful eyes. By this time, everyone was always watching me. I clenched my jaw. Around me, women were on their knees weeping and wailing. Papa was dearly loved despite the fact that he'd married my mother, a woman with a daughter like me, an Ewu daughter. That had long been excused as one of those mistakes even the greatest man makes. Over the wailing, I heard my mother's soft whimper. She had suffered the greatest loss. Now it was her turn to have her last moment. Afterwards, they'd take him for cremation. I looked down at his face one last time. I'll never see you again, I thought. I wasn't ready. I blinked and touched my chest. That's when it happened, when I touched my chest. At first, it felt like an itchy tingle. It quickly swelled into something more. The more I tried to get up, the more intense it grew, and the more my grief expanded. They can't take him, I thought frantically. There's still so much metal left in his shop. He hasn't finished his work. The sensation spread through my chest and radiated out to the rest of my body. I rounded my shoulders to hold it in. And then I started pulling it from people around me. I shuddered and gnashed my teeth. I was filling with rage. Oh, not here, I thought, not at Papa's ceremony. Life wouldn't leave me alone long enough to even mourn my dead father. Behind me, the wailing stopped. All I heard was a gentle breeze. It was utterly eerie. Something was below my feet, in the ground or maybe somewhere else. Suddenly, I was slammed with the pained emotions of everyone around me for Papa. On instinct, I laid my hands on his arm. People started screaming. I didn't turn around. I was too focused on what I had to do. Nobody tried to pull me away. No one touched me. My friend Luyu's uncle was once struck by lightning during a rare dry season Ungwa storm. He survived, but he couldn't stop talking about how it felt like being violently shaken from inside out. That's how I felt now. I gasped with horror. I couldn't take my hand from Papa's arm. It was fused to him. My sand-colored skin tapered to his gray-brown skin from my palm, a mound of mingled flesh. I started screaming. It caught in my throat and I coughed. Then I stared. Papa's chest was slowly moving up and down, up and down. He was breathing. I was both repulsed and desperately hopeful. I took a deep breath and cried, "Live, Papa, live!" A pair of hands settled on my wrists. I knew exactly whose they were. One of his fingers was broken and bandaged, and if he didn't get his hands off me, I'd hurt him far worse than I had 5 days prior. "Onye Sonwu," Aro said into my ear, quickly taking his hands from my wrists. Oh, how I hated him. But I listened. "He's gone," he said. "Let go so we can all be free of it." Somehow, I did. I let go of Papa. Everything went dead silent again, as if the world for a moment were submerged in water. Then the power that had built up inside me burst. My veil was blown off my head and my freed braids whipped back. Everyone and everything was blown back. Aro, my mother, family, friends, acquaintances, strangers, the table of food, the 50 yams, the 13 large monkey bread fruits, the 5 cows, the 10 goats, the 30 hens, and much sand. Back in town, the power went off for about 30 seconds. Houses would need to be swept of sand and the computers would be taken in for dust damage. That underwater-like silence again. I looked down at my hand. When I tried to remove it from my Papa's cold, dead arm, there was a sound of peeling, like weak glue flaking off. My hand left a silhouette of dried mucus on Papa's arm. I rubbed my fingers together. More of the stuff crackled and peeled from between them. I took one more look at Papa, then I fell to the side and passed out. That was 4 years ago. Now see me. People here know that I caused it all. They want to see my blood, they want to see me suffer, and then they want to kill me. Whatever happens after this, let me stop. Tonight you want to know how I came to be what I am. You want to know how I got here. It's a long story, but I'll tell you. You're a fool if you believe what others are saying about me. I tell you my story to avert all those lies. Thankfully, even my long story will fit on that laptop of yours. I have 2 days. I hope it's enough time. It will all catch up with me soon. My mother named me Onye Sonwu. It means who fears death. She named me well. I was born 20 years ago during troubled times. Ironically, I grew up far from all the killing. Thank you. So now we talk. Oh, why, thank you.
You're really good. I want to say a word about genre before we start talking. Mm-hmm. There was a professor of comparative literature at Harvard in the 50s and 60s named Renato Pajoli. He was killed in a car crash in 1962. He hated genre. His idea about genre was, if somebody's working in a genre and the writing's no good, who cares? Mm-hmm. And if the writing is good, the genre doesn't matter. I've heard your writing described as speculative. Well, I don't know any fiction that isn't speculative.
Right.
As science fiction, fantasy, magical. So I really liked what Chris said before, because at the heart of your writing whatever it is you're doing are those basic human issues of growing up, coming to terms with the world, dealing with violence, dealing with death, dealing with love, and the same adjectives or nouns I'd use about Faulkner, I can use about you, because you're dealing with the same kinds of stuff. Oh, it's true. So in a way, genre is reductive.
Yes.
That said, you do it.
Okay, we're here, we're there.
Could you say a bit about why you went in this direction with speculative science fiction, fantasy, whatever?
Yeah, well, from the very first story that I wrote, it had speculative elements. And I think that the first story that I wrote was called The House of Deformities, and it was just about my sisters and I. We had to go to the bathroom, and we were in Nigeria. We were like 9, 10, and 11. And we had stopped at this very mysterious house, like restaurant house. And we were told that the bathroom was in the back. And when we went, we just had a series of very, very strange experiences that included a woman with a cleaver, an old woman with a cleaver, a group of bulldog puppies and ducks, and the ducks were pink, and vultures. And vultures, yes. And one of the details I always remember was that, and this was a story that my sisters and I, we still talk about to this day, the House of Deformities. And when we finally got to the outhouses, there were vultures on the top of the outhouses, and the outhouses, the roofs were made of tin, and you could hear the talons of the vultures, yes, scraping and clacking against. Oh, what a detail. So when I started writing in a creative writing class, and when I took that class, and I was asked to just make up my own story for the first time, that was the first story to come to me. So it wasn't like when people ask me, how come you write these stories that are set in parts of Africa, especially Nigeria? That's just how it happened. So that first story, when I told the story of the House of Deformities, the speculative elements just came forth naturally, because in a lot of ways, that's my worldview. I see the world as a magical place naturally. So when I sat down to write, it was like those little things that I see that other people may see or may not see, I was able to describe them. And so and I remember my creative writing teacher saying that this is magical realism that you're writing, and then at some point, I jumped the rails into fantasy, like where those things that were just kind of like worldview things, where things that I was seeing, I wanted to add. So if I see, for example, and I was mentioning earlier today, if I see butterflies as fairies, then I'd throw a real fairy in there with the butterfly fairy, and so it all got mixed together. So it really started with my worldview, just like my general, the fantastical part of it. The science fiction part is a little more complicated. It has more, the science fictional aspects came later, where, and those came from when I would go to Nigeria and see the interplay with the way people use technology, and I wasn't seeing that in literature, and so that led me to start writing science fiction and wanting to see Africa in the future, just Africa, the continent, in the future. I wanted to see that, and I wasn't seeing that, so I figured might as well do it myself.
Well, one of the things that's fascinating about your stuff is the way you do folklore anthropology. I mean, I could teach a folklore class using your books, and the science fiction and imagination. You're the only writer I know who brings all of that together. So could you talk a little more about, you just said you see the world magically. Mm-hmm. What does that mean?
Well, like I could.
Don't tell me to read your book.
No, I can explain it. Okay, here's an example. I was recently in Phoenix, Arizona, and it was a very busy trip, and I love Arizona. I love the dryness. I just love the heat. And I got a moment to just sit. And I remember sitting on this rock, looking out at the desert. And while I was sitting there, I just stopped, a really fat grasshopper came and sat on a rock in front of me, and I love grasshoppers, so that was a big deal to me. That was a big deal. So the grasshopper sat in a rock in front of me, then a butterfly sat next to me, and then a lizard came and sat near my foot. And this was just from stopping. And I'm just like, I'm just feeling the energy around me. I mean, that's my world. Like I notice things like that. I see things like that. I'm the one who notices like all of the animals that are around and just hanging around and part of the world. And I see those things as magical. That's a magical thing. That is not something that I would see, like when I'm on the highway, I always see the hawks that are always on the light fixtures. I see those things. And so I just see a lot, and I think that's, and in seeing those things, there's like it's just does that make sense? The world being a magical place, just being able to see those things around me, that there is more there than most would think.
Well, one of the things about the world of magic, a magical world, is things make sense. But
Sort of.
Yeah, sort of. And that's what you write about. I mean, in the real world, a lot of things make no sense whatsoever. Mm-hmm. But you have all these forces. People see things in the future. Mm-hmm. People know where they're going. I want to ask you about unless you don't want anybody to hear about it, the final chapter of the Death Book.
Ah, okay.
Would you?
Yeah, I rarely get to talk about that. So
well, let me say one thing. Every chapter in this book is numbered except that one.
Yes. Okay, so what's your question?
That's it.
I know what you're asking.
I want you to talk about it a little bit.
Okay, so for those who haven't read Who Fears Death, oh well. Okay, so yeah, the ending of Who Fears Death has a story in itself. Okay, so I'm not going to even explain it, so I'm just going to talk. So those of you who've read it and know what I'm talking about, that's cool. If you haven't, that's fine. The original ending was that she died, and that was it. I was having I was questioning a lot of things about life and death. And so the original ending was extremely brutal. And that was how I wrote it. And I had a few readers, a few beta readers who read the book and got to that ending. And after all that happens in the book, they were like, "You cannot do that. This is brutal." No.
We love this girl.
Yes, exactly. It's like, you can't just do that. And I was like, that's life. That's how it is. I'm not changing it. And so then my agent...
And I told you in chapter 2 how it was going to end.
Yeah, exactly. It's told, it's not a surprise. And then my agent read it, and my agent said the same thing. He's like, "You cannot do this, Nnedi. No, you cannot brutally have this happen to your main character, and then that's it." And I was like, "No, this is how I wrote it. This is my book, and this is how I wrote it." I'm like, "Then let's just see what happens if we sell it." We sold it, and then my editor read it again and came to me and was like, "Nnedi, you need to change this. You can't do that." And I was like, "Okay, fine, let me just think about it." And so I thought about it, and the ending, it's not an open ending. I know exactly what happens in that ending. I know exactly what happens. And some can interpret it as she dies and then moves into the spirit world. Some can interpret it as she goes somewhere else. Do you want the answer, or do you not?
No, I just wanted to see what you'd
Yeah,
say.
I knew what I was
If those of you
doing.
who haven't read it, it's a fascinating... the whole novel's told in the first person, except at the very end we get 3 voices. And it's the last one that just opens it up beautifully.
Yeah.
They were right.
They were right. Yes, they were right. This is why I believe in editors and and listening to beta readers.
A couple other questions, then we'll open it up to the room. Could you talk a little bit about how you feel about using folklore in your work? Do you read it, or do you just talk to people?
I listen, and that's like, I think, one of my best qualities as a writer. I listen, and one of my favorite things to do is when I'm in Nigeria or when I'm around family, especially the elders, is sneak around and listen and just kind of grab things and then listen for those places where listen for those stories that one, that people don't want to tell, or that they're hesitant, or that they're whispering about, and two, those stories about the mystical. I love the mystical, and anything about those things just attracts me, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that growing up, any of the mystical stuff, because my family is Igbo, we're Igbo, and so due to colonialism, especially once the missionaries came in, their teachings made a lot of the indigenous beliefs and systems and cosmologies taboo. And so, like, when you talk about those things, they're either viewed as satanic or evil, and that's the way things are now. And so, for some reason, I have an ear for it, so if I hear someone talking about some of the mystical things and folklore, I get interested, and then people clam up and don't want to talk about it and want to keep things secret. So I think that's really where it started with me. It really, the first mystical element were masquerades. Masquerades are manifestations of the spirits and the dead. And so people would dress up in these elaborate costumes, and there would be, when you don the costume, you become that deity or that spirit. And there were these secret societies where, and they were mostly men, that was one thing that got me. They were actually all men, and they were the only ones who could put this costume on. And so I have stories about masquerades in Nigeria, but like those, just the mystery of it really, really captured my attention, and I became obsessed with learning more about masquerades and talking about them, and then working them into stories. The book Famished Road by Ben Okri was a really big influence on me when I read it, because that was the first time where I saw a masquerade written about in a narrative the way that I imagined them. Because with my big imagination and my way of just seeing things as being just more, whenever I would see masquerades, I wouldn't see someone in a costume. I would see the dancing spirit, and so I would never see that in literature. And it was the first time was when I read Ben Okri's Famished Road. There's a line in there that talks about a masquerade that bursts through, and it's on a horse, and it's absolutely terrifying and vivid. So, yeah. And one last thing I want to say about folklore is I don't have a fear of including it and incorporating it into my stories, even though there are constantly people telling me that I should, that I'm playing with something that's dangerous, that these stories are not that they're sacred, because I feel like I have a respect for them and I have an understanding of them, but that they're potent. And
power.
And if you write about them, they will affect you. It will come. You write about them, and they'll write about you. Yeah. That's what one of my uncles said to me, and that always stayed with me. Yeah.
Could you say something about the difference between writing for young people and writing for adults? You don't have to.
No, it's a complicated question. I think there isn't, like, when I sit down to write something, I don't think, okay, I'm writing for adults or I'm writing for young adults. This is what I have to do. I just write the story. And so this leads to some really, I've written some, like, there's a novel I'm working on now where I'm like, I don't even know what this is. This has like elements of everything in it, and I don't know. I'm not worried about it, just writing it. But I think the biggest difference between, if there is a difference between writing for young adults and adults, is if there is something, a subject matter that's really, really heavy. If I'm writing for young adults, I feel a greater responsibility to show all of the angles to it and present it the way it needs to be presented. If I'm writing for adults, I know I could just throw it in there and I don't have to tiptoe as much around it. But if I don't, there is no topic that I would not write about in a young adult. it's more about how I write about it. It's not that I over-explain it or I'm softer about it, not at all. It's just there's certain elements of whatever that issue is that I feel like I have to present well, if that makes sense.
That makes sense.
Okay, cool.
Just two more. You got whited recently.
Oh, yeah, I mean, not recent. It wasn't recent. It wasn't recent. You're talking about the Shadow Speaker cover? Yeah, that cover, wow. Okay, so it wasn't recent, but when I tweeted about it on Twitter, because I was talking about whitewashing and how whitewashing can happen, how some white readers will whitewash things in their minds. So that was what I was tweeting about initially, and then I talked about this incident with the Shadow Speaker. And when I tweeted about the Shadow Speaker, it went viral. It did. It went viral, and I was glad, because it needed to be. This is something I needed to talk about. The Shadow Speaker was my second novel, and it was published by Disney Hyperion. It is a post-apocalyptic, back when not a million people were doing it. So this was 2007, okay? So this was like before all that. 2007, post-apocalyptic, set in the country of Niger with fantastical elements. You've got a Haitian mad scientist who created peace bombs that he wanted to blow up to create where nuclear bombs destroyed. And so when he launched them at the same time, it brought magic back to it was crazy, yeah. So that's the Shadow Speaker. Main character is Iji, who is sub-Saharan African, West African. She is described multiple times. I'm not bashful about describing what my characters look like. Described multiple times as very dark-skinned. She shaves her head at the beginning of the story. There are no white people in the entire novel, none. And because it takes place in Niger. So this is published by Disney, and it's getting close to the date of when it should be published. They had replaced my first editor, so the book was orphaned, which is already bad. So the second editor is, and it was orphaned 4 times four times. So there's that issue. But they eventually had to do the cover. So because it was sort of rushed, because I think they were late with something, so instead of showing me the cover like they normally would, and it's in my contract that I get to approve the cover, and so instead of showing me the cover and then we talk about it and then they perfect it, they showed me what they considered the finalized cover and had already sent it off to Amazon when they showed it to me and put it on the advanced reading copies. So when they showed me this cover, the cover had a white girl on the cover walking into the desert. I'm like, there are all sorts of issues with that. But there's the main one of this was a lie. Mm-hmm. They'd whitewashed my cover. And I was extremely irate. And it's one of those things where you've heard of it before. I know they whitewashed Octavia Butler's covers and Steve Barnes, and many covers and films have been whitewashed. So it's one thing to know about the phenomena, but when it happens to you, it is just it is something else. It was just like, oh my God, this is happening. What do I do? And this was my second novel, and I'm dealing with Disney. You don't want to mess with Disney.
With Disney, right?
You don't want to mess with Disney. They call it the mouse, for a reason. So I remember thinking that. I'm like, okay, I'm a fairly new author. What do I do? But then the emotion and the rage came forth and handled it for me, because I was extremely irate. And I was like, no, I was ready to pull the book. I didn't even care. So this is when it's good to have an agent. I have an agent. People often ask, should you have an agent or not? I say yes, because when things like this happen, you need someone eloquent and level-headed to speak for you. So I told my agent everything, how I felt and what needed to be done, and the fact that this was not going to happen. And this was before Twitter. And she took that, and my agent was also African American, and she took that information and relayed it to Disney. And they're like, oh, okay. Their excuse was that they couldn't find stock footage of black girls. I was like, lies, lies. So they came back to me with where they like used Photoshop to darken her up and I guess nap up her hair a little bit, and it was not good enough. I was like, no, 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 no. And so by the third time they came back with a properly black girl walking into the desert. She had little twists, which is not my character at all, but I was so glad that they finally made her black that I'm like, okay. So that was the story with that. And I've always, since then, even before that, from my very first book, I made sure to have it in my contract that I get to okay the cover, because that has always been important to me, and I knew of those issues, but never did I think I would have to like use
Go
that.
to war over
you
it.
know? Yeah, it was very disturbing. It was very disturbing.
Well, it's totally antithetical to what's going on inside the book.
Yes,
Okay,
exactly.
Final question. Is it harder getting on a camel or getting off a camel?
That's an easy one. I rode a camel in Kenya, last summer, and getting off the camel is the hardest part. It's like, it's actually terrifying because they're up really high. They're very peaceful creatures. They're very nice and really cute. I managed to get on this camel. My camel's name was Yasim. Yeah, Yasim. And we were on the beach in Kenya, right off of the Indian Ocean. It was a surreal moment. I was with my daughter, and we saw this caravan of camels walking across the beach. And we were like, oh my God! And we ran to see what he was doing. He's like, oh yeah, camel rides. We got on the camel. So I get on the camel. They have really long eyelashes as well, which are really pretty. And that was easy enough. But when you get off, they have to sit down, and they sit down really fast. Okay? So you just got to hang on for dear life and shut your eyes, and they get down, and then you kind of just roll off. So yeah, getting off the camel is difficult.
Okay, questions. Thank you, Nnedi. Anybody? Can we turn up the room lights a little bit, maybe? Anybody?
Yes,
Yeah.
Steve.
You mentioned before that you've been criticized by Nigerians for writing about Nigeria without being born in Nigeria, or something like that.
It was a female genital mutilation for not being. I was not allowed to write about being mutilated, I guess is the way you'd put it, circumcised, unless I were. I couldn't. Yeah.
Was there ever any question about your being genuine or not having been born?
Yeah, that's always an interesting, there's always that suspicion. And I've spoken in Nigeria several times now, and that's one of the questions that I wait for. I listen for it because I know, I like answering it because I know that a lot of people wonder about that. They're like, why do you think you're able to write about Nigeria in particular when you are Nigerian American? And so when that question comes, I always say that I'm Igbo, so there's that, and I was born and raised within a Nigerian family, but also I've been there many times, and so there's that. And then thirdly, when I do write, like for example, my novel Lagoon is set in Nigeria, and it's about aliens coming to Lagos and the madness that ensues. It's like because my family has been taking my siblings and I back there since I was very young. I don't have a romanticized view of Nigeria. I've had my own experiences there, and I always say the most wonderful things in my life have happened in Nigeria, and the worst things in my life have happened in Nigeria. So I don't have that romanticized view, and I also fully acknowledge that I'm Nigerian American. That is my identity, and that's how I'm able to write what I write. I'm able to write a story about aliens coming to Lagos because of my outsider-insider point of view. And I think that I'm very honest in what I write, in what I'm saying. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Cool. Mm-hmm.
And you sort of implied that there's a substantial difference between the way that technology is used in Africa and the way that it's used in the United States. Could you talk a little bit more about that and how, specifically, how that sort of enters into the fantasy aspects of your work?
I have to think about that second part, but yeah. Well, one example is that portable technology became more important there faster than it did here. For example, desktop computers were never really a big thing there because you have the power going off every 2 seconds, or you don't have, or your building uses a generator, or the infrastructure is not there. So therefore, laptop computers and cell phones became really important there before they were here. So that's one example. And so I take that idea, and when it comes to the science fictional aspects, I'll like take it into the future. And one idea that I've been thinking about lately is drones and the use of drones and what role they would play in Nigeria and how they would be treated, and how cultural beliefs and ideas would affect the way people reacted to them. So things like that, those kind of things fascinate me. And I guess when it comes to the fantastical elements, what do you mean, the science fictional elements or the fantastical?
I thought that was the connection you were making. But it sounds like the connection is much more to the science fiction aspects.
Yeah, or wait, the connection to...
The way that technology is used in Africa, the influence that it's had on your work, the interest in your work.
Okay, yeah.
In that specificity.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, well, with the fantastical element, well, I mean, it's always going to be on the science fictional side, but like, I do think that like the way that technology is used is affected by cultural beliefs, and a lot of those cultural beliefs do verge on the fantastical. Fantastical is a difficult phrase to use when we're talking about things that people actually believe in. So it's like, so maybe the mystical aspects of it. So the way that certain types of technology will be received there due to existing mystical beliefs would be different than in this country. Yeah, I think those are things that I definitely have kicked around and written about. Yeah.
I heard you say something else in your initial comment about technology and your writing in Africa. And I was struck by something I heard about Star Trek. If I mean Star Wars, someone just can correct me.
I will.
But I think it was in Star Trek, and the African American woman who was on the Enterprise.
Okay, Uhura?
Star Trek thing.
Yeah.
Uhura. And that I remember someone, I think it was Whoopi Goldberg, said how incredible that was for her as a young girl, because often when you see these movies of the future or science
Yeah.
fiction, they're never included. And so one of the ends of your comment, the initial comment was, and seeing Africa in this space. And I wanted to know if you had more to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of the future not being white is very, it's one of the reasons why I started writing, because I wanted to see that. That's very important. I think that's important. That's probably one of the reasons why many people of color start writing science fiction, not in reaction to, but because they want to see the inclusion. And that's extremely important. And I'm always saying this about even just the act of writing science fiction is important. It should be, how should I put it? Science fiction should be written by all cultures around the world. That's important. That's not just for the sake of entertainment, I think it's important for other reasons as well, because science fiction is like a think tank in a lot of ways too. Science fiction also leads to a lot of the technology that we use. Up to until recently, much of what is considered science fiction has been dominated by the West. And if you think about it, that means that much of the imagination of the future and of future technologies has been driven by the West. That's highly problematic. And it's not just because, it's not like an issue of race or whatever, but people create those things that they need. So if you have one group of people creating what they need, and then other groups of people using the things that they've created in ways that they can figure out how to use, versus people from around the world creating things that they need, we're going to just have more, we'll have more ideas and more things invented. Can you imagine what people, let's say, Tuareg people in the Sahara Desert, if they imagine the future? You know, they're going to put themselves in the center of, because that's what human beings do. They always like to put themselves in the center of everything. Unfortunately, that's one of our greatest flaws. But if you take many different types of people who put themselves in the center of something and then imagine a future and imagine what they need, the technologies that they need, you're going to have far more. You know, and I think that that's one of the most important things about science fiction. It's not just the entertainment aspect of it, but it's just that imagining the future is really, really important for all peoples.
That's beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
We have time for one more. Yeah.
For the younger, I guess, students in this room, maybe some writers, including your class, what are some key factors I would say would really help them write a story and make it concrete and really say science fiction?
I mean, it really depends. It depends on, because what makes something science fiction, categories always just make me uncomfortable. Like categories, I feel they're reductive and they're limiting, as you put in the beginning very well. So I think that if we're talking about stories that imagine, I think that there isn't one thing that I could say where, okay, you just do this and this will make it better. I mean, it really depends. But I think that what does make a good science, for me, in my opinion, what makes a good science fiction story is there still should be the element of, there should always be a connection to our world and to the real. There should always be that connection. Also, research is always good. And that's one thing that I am discovering. I mean, of course, I love Star Wars so much. I do. And they have where the ships take off and there's no one dealing with the issues that one deals with when you take off and when you're adjusting, and they don't deal with that. So yeah, I mean, so there's plenty of science fiction out there where we're dealing with the scientific aspects of things is not really important. But I still think that the best science fiction does kind of take that into consideration. You know, it doesn't just completely ignore it. Yeah, I mean, there isn't one answer to that. There isn't one answer to that. It really depends on the type of story you're telling and how you're telling. There's so many factors that would come into that. Yeah.
What happened to your spider?
Oh, the spider. How do you know about the spider? Oh boy. Okay, I had a pet spider. I'm terrified of spiders, by the way. I'm absolutely, positively terrified of spiders. There was one in Clemens luckily it was outside, but I was looking at it like, oh, here they come. It's warm enough, here they come. I had out of nowhere, this was in the middle of the winter, out of nowhere this huge garden spider just appeared in my daughter's room, just out of nowhere, and set up shop, just like right there in a corner and stay there. And I was terrified. I'm like, I'm not going to kill it. It's a garden spider. You don't kill garden spiders. They're not supposed to be alive right now. I don't know what's going on. And so my daughter and I kind of stared at it for a while. And then eventually, 2 days passed. It's still there. And I don't know, me being who I am, it's just strange. I don't know. And my daughter's strange, too. And we, for some reason, got it into our heads, okay, let's go to the pet store and get crickets. And feed the spider. And I'm telling you, I'm terrified of spiders. We went and got some crickets, and I made her do it. I was too scared. I'm like, okay, throw it on the web. And so she went and she did it, and we were successful. Immediately, the spider attacked it and ate the cricket. It was very disturbing. So yeah, so we kept the spider for several weeks, and it was alive and stayed in the same place. And every day I would wake up and look in there to make sure it was still there, and it was still there. And then, a few weeks ago, it expired.
But it had a good life.
It had a good life.
It had a good life.
Yes. And I studied that spider, and they don't live for very long. Oh. So it lived its life happily, and it was good. Yeah.
Good. Nnedi, thank you.
It's a pleasure.